Sagantaakeenya injil qabna daqiiqa muraasa booddee tafuu keenyaaf nuuf galchaasnii jenna. Kanaaf hundumtuu dooddoo isaa yoo qabatee gaariidha sirriitti ol dhaggeeffachuudhaaf akkasumatti galatooma ulfaadha. Welcome everyone. Afaan Ingiliffaan xiqqoo jetti maguudhaaf jechuun shaakaludha kanaa ta'u. Welcome everyone. We are sorry for not starting on time because we are now late a few minutes now. So I'm going to welcome everyone and introduce you the programs which are going to be held this afternoon. So I'm not going to continue all the things I am going to say in English, but just welcoming. I have the welcoming words, but I don't have all the words which can represent the Afan Oromo language. So thank you for coming and thank you everyone. Akkasumallee yoo amleen akkitaniin gara duubaanii qabu jechuu danda'achuu barbaadanii sagantaa kana jalqabuudhaaf boogaarumaa waaqessaanii achi as afeera. Obbo Garuman Sinenis keessummootaanis baga nagaadhaan dhuftan akka jedhanii kan achi as afeera. Isa dura garuu sagantaalee jiran beeksisuu barbaada. So the following are the programs which are going to be taking place at this place. So according to the schedule, it says at 5 p.m. Welcoming and introduction by Mr. Garuma Wakesa, and he's going to welcome the guests and every one of you. And then presentation on recent human rights situation in Ethiopia, the Oromo case. And that's going to be held by Mr. Felix Horn, Human Rights Watch researcher. And then following that, we are going to have a dinner all together. And then thank you speech to the event sponsor and Human Rights League of Horn of Africa supporters. And presentation on Human Rights League of Horn of Africa in 2015 and 2016 achievements, challenges, future plans, which is going to be held by Mr. Garuma Wakesa, and all the entertainment will follow that program. So I would like to welcome Mr. Garuma Wakesa to welcome the guests and welcome Mr. Garuma in the stage soil. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for introduction. Actually, I'm not going to give you an introduction. An introduction is going to be given by Mr. Robert. It's a great mistake. So I'm going to invite him to introduce to you our speaker, first speaker, Felix Horn, Human Rights Watch researcher, focusing on Horn of Africa, especially Ethiopia and Eritrea. So I want to say welcome. Baga hundi kesan nagaan uftani. Baga wagaan gue, waga sargafa Human Rights League of Africa. Waga sargafa kenya kuni. Udah galauman galgau kesan ibisi, asitar galgau kesan ibisi. Sagantani mamera. Now I'm going to invite Mr. Robert Mr. Robert is the vice chairman of Human Rights League of the whole of Africa. The chairman has got some a problem of just jamming. He's driving from far, so he couldn't make at this time. He's coming out very late. So instead of him, we are going to invite Mr. Robert, the vice chairman of Human Rights League of the whole of Africa, to introduce to you Mr. Felix. At the same time, he's going to say just welcome speech. He's going to say something about how people are. We need people to support Human Rights League, not only Human Rights League, all human rights organizations, because you know that human rights, having an organization such as Human Rights League is not for something good, okay? Because it is simply a prerequisite to have. Why? Because we need in the world peaceful life, peace, and security. So unless and otherwise, we don't need human rights organizations if there is a peace and security in the world. In any way, so he's going to give you a speech on introduction, as an introduction. So I'm going to invite Mr. Robert. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Jeroma. I'm Robert Stephen Higgins, and as Jeroma mentioned, I've recently become vice chairman of the board. In that capacity, I'd like to welcome everybody here today. It's a pretty good turnout, and all the members of the board are very thankful for that. It is the 9th anniversary fundraising event, and I think you all know that this organization depends very much on money in order to do the things that it does in reporting abuses in the Horn of Africa. So I want to thank you all for appearing here today and contributing to the funds for the organization. You probably know that throughout the year, you can also contribute through automatic transfers from your bank, and the method for doing that can be found at the website for the Human Rights League. Now, the other thing I want to do is to introduce our speaker for today. He is Felix Horn, who comes to us from the Human Rights Watch. Felix works for Human Rights Watch in Ottawa. He's a graduate master's degree from Dalhousie University. It was in another field, but working in that field, he worked on a project in Ethiopia and became acquainted with the situation over there. He's been with Human Rights Watch for 5 years, and I noticed that in the past 2 years, he's produced quite a number of short reports on the situation over there. So I'm very anxious to hear what he's going to tell us. And without any further comment, I'd like to welcome Felix Horn to our meeting today.
So I'm going to talk about 3 things. I want to give a little bit of an overview of what's happening right now in Oromia from the perspective of Human Rights Watch. I don't think this is going to be anything new for the people in this room. You know very well what's happening there with the protests and with the crackdown, but I would like to provide a summary of what we found in our research and our interviews with victims and protesters. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of access to information, how groups like ours get information, how decision makers, different governments get information, and what they do with that information, because I think that's very important. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Human Rights League Horn of Africa fits into that, and why this NGO is very important in terms of documenting what's happening on the ground in Oromia and throughout Ethiopia. So first to the protests. So Human Rights Watch has interviewed around 125 protesters, victims, perpetrators, witnesses to what's been happening since November of 2015. We've also interviewed, maybe 75 or so from the 2014 protests in Oromia. And these interviews are a couple of hours long. We've also talked to several hundred other people, just sort of short discussions about what they see, what they saw, etc., etc. And those 125 interviews encompass around 70 different locations in Oromia. It was quite incredible to me when I think of the scale, like the breadth of this protest movement. That right now we have documented around 600 individual protests within Oromia since November. I mean, that's mind-boggling to me. In a country where there's very little opportunity to protest, and those that do, of course, risk arrest or worse. And if we know about that many protests, how many protests are there out there that just aren't documented, that we don't know anything about? And it was striking to me as I did more and more of these interviews that every time we talked to somebody about a protest, that was, again, another new protest that we hadn't previously documented. There were just so many individuals from places whose voices had just not been heard by the outside world. So Human Rights Watch estimates that around 400 people have been killed. We don't say that with complete confidence. We're not on the ground. We can't document every killing that's happening. But the killings that we've been able to document, or where we feel there is a high likelihood, or the information that's out about the killing is quite credible, we feel is around 400. And of course, Hrlha and Human Rights League Court of Africa has documented many of those killings. We feel that tens of thousands have been detained throughout this protest. Thousands have disappeared. Obviously it's a major event in the history of Ethiopia and the history of the Horn of Africa. So what Human Rights Watch would do when we look at these protests is to try to identify patterns. What are the different patterns of behavior either by the security forces, the different types of abuses. And one thing that we've seen very clearly is that there's definitely a pattern in terms of how security forces are behaving on the streets of Oromia. In the first month or so, when it was mainly regional security forces along with some federal police, we saw that excessive force was being used, tear gas was being used, the security forces were going in and beating protesters, there were mass arrests. But once the Prime Minister of Ethiopia went on state-run television and basically announced that this was to be a military operation, things dramatically escalated on the streets. We saw military were present in most locations of Oromia, not all, but most. And then the regional security forces, who of course mostly ethnic Oromos, took a much less important role in handling the protests. So what we saw in the vast majority of the protests that we were able to document is the security forces used tear gas initially, and in the confusion that the tear gas brought up, live ammunition was used. Not in every protest, but in the vast majority. And in most of those cases, it was just complete indiscriminate firing. It was just sort of spraying of bullets into the crowds. There was not any sort of targeted killings. It was not like that person there is somebody that we've been looking for, let's aim for him. It was just random spraying of bullets in the vast majority of locations. And of course, because young students were the ones that were most heavily involved in a lot of these protests, particularly in the early months, they were the ones that bore the brunt of this live ammunition, and we documented a lot of young students, including children, who were killed by security forces. We saw mass arrests. I think there's been lots of discussion about the arrests at the protests. So during the chaos, during the tear gas, during the use of live ammunition, security forces, including regional security forces, were going around and arresting a variety of individuals. But we sort of have seen three main times when arrests were made. One was during those protests. The second was at night, and this came up a lot in interviews, where security forces, and it was usually a mix of federal police, the army, sometimes regional police, sometimes local police, would go door to door just looking for students, looking for people that are in that age bracket. to be arrested. We documented a lot of cases where individuals who were harboring students were also arrested. We documented situations where parents were arrested because their students weren't home. Security forces were going to take their house. They knew that there was 4 children that lived there, and they weren't there, so they took the parents instead. So this sort of collective punishment, if you will, within different communities. The subsequent roundups. So after the protests had sort of subsided in any particular location, there was a very clear effort by security forces to round up what they saw as the most influential local Oromas. And some of the former security officials that we spoke with, because obviously some of them have also fled their posts, their jobs, told us that these lists were developed, sometimes just through the local security office, sometimes in collaboration with the local government. And it was the best that were to be targeted. It was the teachers that had the ability to mobilize students to protest. It was the best students in the classes who again had that sort of influence over their classmates to protest further. It was musicians. Everyone here knows about the power of Oromo music in order to mobilize over different issues. And of course, it was opposition politicians too. And that happened from the lowest levels, those local opposition members who were quite influential, all the way up to the Hrlha of the Oromo world. The vast majority of those individuals that were arrested and that are still in detention have not been charged. Again, no one's looking very surprised at anything I'm saying here. They were not charged. They have not seen a lawyer. They have not seen a court. Very, very few of them have actually been charged. I think there's been a lot of attention on the charges under the anti-terrorism law, like Hrlha and the other 21, is it, of individuals, OFC individuals. And obviously that's a very egregious set of charges for somebody that was such a staunch advocate for non-violence. And at Human Rights Watch, we believe that it's, for somebody that was so vocal about the need to resolve Oromo grievances through non-violent means, for him to be arrested and charged on the anti-terrorism law sends a terrible message to all those young children who are on the streets of Oromia peacefully protesting. The other thing that came up in the interviews a lot was just the scale of these protests. Everyone in this room knows that this happens every few years in Oromia. Some sort of protest or some sort of crackdown from the government. There's lots of arrests, lots of fear is instilled into the population. But a lot of older Oromos that we spoke with said they had never seen anything quite like this. The scale of these arrests were unlike anything they had seen. And this we heard from a variety of different places, from all the zones of Oromia. We interviewed individuals from all the zones. So it seemed very, very widespread. I think there was one young girl that, to me, just sort of summed up the scale of the crackdown within her community. She was a grade 8 student from RC. She said of the 28 students in her class, there was only 4 left. 12 of them had been arrested, 1 had been killed by security forces, 4 had disappeared, and so on and so forth. And the first thing that struck me when I talked to her was that she was so committed to her education. That's what she wanted to do. She was very proud to be going to school. She took her studies very seriously. She had no appetite for politics whatsoever. She didn't seem terribly interested in the issues that students were protesting about, but she just wanted to go to school. And because of the protests and the resulting crackdown, she felt she was no longer able to do that. Her teacher had also been arrested. Because the protests had been quite vociferous in her community, the teacher was blamed for that. So he had been arrested. And so no classes were happening, period. The detentions, the vast majority of detentions that we documented were quite short. There was usually some form of mistreatment, usually sort of beatings with sticks and the like. But certainly not like some of the sort of really horrible torture that we documented in different places in detention in Oromia. Now, obviously, we're only speaking to those individuals that have been released from detention. We're not speaking to those that are still in detention, because we don't have that access either. Criminal charges, I mentioned Dr. Hrlha. There's been some other opposition party members, like from the Blue Party, that have also been charged for their comments on social media about the protests. We've also seen students that protested in front of the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa that were charged under the criminal code, not under the anti-terrorism law, but under the criminal code, and they face up to 3 years for what's very clearly a peaceful protest. I mean, you can see the entire video on YouTube or Facebook. In fact, that was actually cited as evidence in the charge sheet. I think, in addition to sort of these egregious rights violations that I'm speaking about, this has also had a massive impact on education and healthcare. And I mean, a lot of the students that we interviewed were in Ethiopia at the time of the interview. A lot weren't. A lot had decided to flee, made the difficult decision to flee Oromia. But what really struck me is how so many of these kids, they felt they had no choice. Schools were closed for long periods of time. Teachers were arrested. The students who either led the protests within the schools or were accused of leading the protests were suspended from school, were arrested. A number of students were released on the condition that they not go back to school. And some of the administrators that we talked to said that, yeah, I mean, that's clear, we're going to punish those individuals who organize protests by not allowing them to complete their education. Other administrators say, well, no, it's more practical than that. It's just because they missed so many classes that they can't possibly do their national exams because they were in detention for so long. So next year, they will be allowed to come back to school. Regardless, the school has been massively interrupted. We've also heard from a number of teachers who, after the protests, reported plainclothes intelligence officers in their classrooms, monitoring students. Some make it very obvious that they're with the security organs. Others don't, but it's sort of obvious when someone doesn't speak a Fana Oromo and is 45 years old and no one's seen them before. He's in a grade 3 classroom. And of course, you can imagine that sort of the impact that has on learning and the ability of students to speak up and openly discuss issues of the day. We've also seen it has a lot of impact on healthcare. A lot of health workers were targeted, in some cases for doing the arms crossed, the symbol of their own protest, doing that on social media. There were a lot of health workers that were arrested because of that. We also documented cases where health workers were targeted because they were seen as giving health care to wounded protesters. In some cases, security officials who'd also been injured during the arrests, or during the protests, went into the health clinics to get treatment and told them to treat them first and not treat some of the injured protesters. And at least in one case, one of those students died from the injuries while he was waiting to be treated. So these are things that we don't have a lot of leverage points on the Ethiopian government, but education, healthcare, etc., is funded by the Western world in many cases. So these are sort of places where we could be applying some pressure. I think for me, the Oromo protests, and I will get to some good news in a little while here. The Oromo protests to me are a very good example of how there's just no ability within which to peacefully express dissent in Ethiopia. And this is one of our constant messages to governments, is that if you give individuals no outlet to express dissent, I mean, we all have concerns, whatever country we live in, we need to have ways to be able to express that peacefully. And when you don't, that creates a very dangerous situation, where the pressures, the tension builds up within a country until it potentially explodes, something that nobody wants to see. So if in Ethiopia, in Oromia specifically, but in Ethiopia generally, we don't see any place to express that dissent. There's no real independent media that can cover the types of events that we've seen in Oromia the last 6 months. I'll talk more about this in a little while. There's very little in the way of independent civil society that can perhaps take your concerns and bring them to the attention of decision makers. We see that elections, there's no opposition politicians. It's 100% EPRDF. Not only in the federal system, but also in all of the regional systems. That's a massive problem. If you have a concern, if let's say your land has been taken from you, what recourse do you have? You can't go to the courts. The courts have shown very little independence in politically sensitive cases. They're not bad in criminal cases, just independent there, but not on politically sensitive cases. So there's just nowhere to really express dissent. So when we think about, you know, an Oromo farmer who's been displaced, let's say from the area around Addis Ababa, as has been happening for 10 years, what do they do? I mean, here we are, where hundreds and thousands of people have been taken to the streets over the master plan, and of course other issues too. And a lot of decision makers around the world were like, well, why are they taking the streets over a master plan? Why is this such a big deal? You know, why haven't we heard about this displacement before? It's because there's no way for people to express those sorts of problems. And they can't do it through the courts. They haven't been able to do it through the electoral process. They haven't been able to do it through the media, through civil society. So what do you have left? Well, you have taking to the streets. You have protests, and that's what's happened. Usually, when there's protest movements like this in Ethiopia, as you know, the government uses a variety of techniques to silence people. It can be, they're very good at instilling fear in populations. You know, they can make targeted arrests, arresting leaders, high-profile leaders, organizers of the protest. You know, they've done this all throughout Ethiopia since they came to power. When that doesn't work, they have violence. You know, the tear gas, the moving in with sticks, etc., etc. And the sort of final trump is to use live ammunition, which they've been doing. They don't seem to have any answers after that. And yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, anyone that's read any of our recent pieces, we talk about this trajectory that Ethiopia is on, where there's just so much pressure building, there's no ability to express dissent. That should be worrying to everyone. But good news, there has to be some good news, there is. So there are a few things that have come out of the protest movement that have, I don't know, we'll call it good news because there's not a lot of good news. But we've seen a resolution in the European Parliament in January. This is the strongest resolution that we've ever seen on Ethiopia out of the European Parliament. And the Parliament is not a sort of binding institution. It's a non-binding resolution. It doesn't require the EU to necessarily do anything, but in terms of its symbolism, I mean, it's an incredibly powerful statement that the Western world, who's a massive ally, massive supporter of Ethiopia, as you know, is very concerned with what is happening in Ethiopia. If you haven't read that, I would really encourage you to read it because it's really, really strong, and it's got some very strong language about the Oromo, not only the protests, but the sort of historic abuses against the Oromo people. Now, how did that come about? Well, it came about through a variety of ways, and a variety of organizations helped push it. But one of the main ways it came about is because of people like you, because of the lobbying of the Oromo diaspora in Europe. They did an incredible job in pushing their MEPs and members of European Parliament to develop this resolution. Similarly, in the United States Senate, there's a draft resolution that's being tabled. And there's currently a push to get different co-sponsors for that. It hasn't passed yet, it's still floating about, but again, just the fact that this has been tabled sends a very strong message to the Ethiopian government from one of their biggest allies, the United States, that things are not going to be the same anymore. And again, that's all happened in large part because of the Oromo diaspora. We've done an incredible job in the United States in mobilizing their senators and their elected representatives. And we're hearing that a very similar resolution may be introduced in the US Congress as well, so on the other side. Which brings me to Canada. In Canada, we haven't been doing so well. As Robert mentioned, I live in Ottawa, so I just down the street from Parliament. And I do think it would be wonderful, and not as hard as we think, to get the Canadian government to take a much stronger stance on what's happening in Oromia specifically and Ethiopia in general. And certainly, I don't know what Human Rights League Horn of Africa's plans are for next year, but I think it's something that should definitely be pushing with the help of everyone in this room, and certainly something we're happy to help with as well. I think some other good things that have come out of the protests. I am obviously not Ethiopian. but I care deeply about the people in Ethiopia. So when I'm out with my friends who are not Ethiopian, and they ask me, what are you working on? And I talk about, the protests in Oromia, and here's what is happening to the Oromos, and here's who the Oromos are. No one's heard of the Oromos. It's very, very frustrating to me, and sure, much more frustrating for all of you. In the early days of the protest, probably 1/3 of the journalists that got in touch with Human Rights Watch to look for information on what's happening didn't refer to the Oromo protest, but referred to the Omo protests. Because Human Rights Watch has done work on the Omo Valley in southern Ethiopia, and so they're reading what was happening in the Omo, and they're reading what's happening in Oromia, and it doesn't add up to them. So they're trying to understand what's going on. It's a shocking ignorance about one of the largest groups in East Africa. But that's changed. Now when reporters call, or when we sit down with government officials in Canada, the US, Europe, everyone knows who the Oromos are. Everyone knows what the GATA system is. There's much more awareness about who the Oromo are and what the different human rights issues and challenges that they face. And so I think that's very positive. Not everyone will agree with me on this fourth point, but I think the other positive is that the government of Ethiopia has made some acknowledgements. They have acknowledged that the protesters had some legitimate grievances, I think was the term that they used. They have apologized in Parliament, although it wasn't the most sincere of apologies. As you know, it was apology for the lives lost, but also lots of rhetoric about the acts of violence committed by protesters. The master plan was cancelled, and of course there's considerable skepticism about what that actually means and whether the government will follow through on that. But these sort of things never would have happened 2 or 3 years ago. So government is acknowledging that some of what the Oromos were expressing on the streets of Oromia were legitimate grievances, and I think that's a positive. We have a long way to go, obviously, for that to result in any change, but I think the fact that they made some acknowledgements is significant. So moving on, I see people sort of paying attention, but there's a lot of you knew everything that I said already, I think. But why has there been a lack of coverage of these protest movements? It's one of the questions that the Oromos ask a lot. There's all these people and students are being killed, many people being arrested, and yet you don't read anything about it in the Globe and Mail or the New York Times or the Guardian or wherever. And I share that frustration. As I said, a lot of journalists got in touch, particularly in the early months of the protest, looking for information on what was happening, trying to understand it, because it's obviously very, very complicated, the underlying motivations for the protests, etc. But I think one of the key reasons why the media hasn't been covering it is, first of all, just a practical one, it's rural in nature. If you look at all the protest movements that have gained a lot of attention internationally, whether that's in Cairo or Tunisia or places like that, it was always in the capital city or a big city. It was predictable when it was going to happen. It was known when it was going to happen. The media could be there, set up their cameras, get all the footage that they wanted, etc. But that's not the case in Oromia. And I think we have to remember that this is still a predominantly rural protest. There hasn't been protests in Finfini and Addis. There's been some, as you know, but certainly nothing that's very widespread. So journalists want to try and go, and they don't just want to talk to victims like we do, but they want to actually be on the ground when it happens. And it's been very difficult to actually give them any sort of reliable information about when that is going to happen. But the other thing is, there's just very little information out there on this protest. As I said, 600 protest locations, hundreds of people killed, across a massive region with 35 million people. That's a major, major story internationally. But there's very little information out there about it. So how would journalists get information on what's been happening? Well, if they're international journalists, they would, of course, go out to the ground. A lot of journalists reported difficulties getting visas to go to Ethiopia. Some of those journalists are not very experienced. They would tell the embassy, no, I want to go and cover the Oromia protests. Of course, you're going to get denied if you do that. Others were smarter and said they wanted to go and cover the drought, Ethiopia's response to the drought, or they wanted to cover Ethiopia's development successes. And then they were able to get visas, and then they would try to sort of sneak off to Oromia in their spare time. A number of international journalists were detained for brief periods of time, for a day, I think was the longest that we heard about. Their translators, their fixers were also detained. We've also seen the targeting of sources. It's something that we deal with all the time. So if you're seen talking to an international journalist, or you're seen talking on the phone to Voice of America, or to OMN, or to Human Rights Watch, or to Amnesty, then you run the risk of arrest. And I think even more importantly than that, whether that actually happens, it's that people perceive that's going to happen. So there's a lot of fear in speaking to foreigners. So then there's domestic media. Again, I think you know the general story, but Ethiopia, we think, has around 15 journalists in prison right now. That makes puts them second in Africa, behind Eritrea. Journalists risk harassment, arrest, or eventual charge under either criminal code or the anti-terrorism law if they don't censor their findings. And I mean, the interviews we've done, it's very clear that journalists feel they either have to toe the party line, so they self-censor their findings, or they risk harassment, eventual arrest, or exile. And there are hundreds of journalists who have fled Ethiopia since 2000. Many of whom are in this room, actually, not many, some of whom are in this room. But I think the other thing in terms of limiting the media, we did a big report on the media freedoms in Ethiopia called Journalism is Not a Crime, which came out in March of last year, 2015. And it was really incredible to me, just not only how they target journalists, which is what we all focus on, but how they target printers, magazines, distributors, those that distribute those magazines or newspapers, how they make it difficult to get a license to do your work. I mean, all of these different techniques, sometimes they will do things like offer you large advertising contracts if you fire journalist X. Of course, in a country where there's not a lot of private money that's not connected to the government, those advertising contracts make it much easier for an independent publication to operate. I don't need to tell people in this room that Ethiopia's media is very dominated by Addis, by Finfini, very Amharic language dominated. Again, for a region of Oromia, 35 million people, likely more, to not have very many, arguably any independent publications is absolutely incredible. I mean, that's like the country the size of Canada, not having any independent publications. Big problem. So, limitations on international media, limitations on domestic media. What about the diaspora media? Well, you have the Oromia Media Network, which has obviously been a big force in Oromia since 2014. ESAT also exists. You have sort of Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, different international stations that broadcast in Amharic or Afan Oromo. OMN has been jammed countless times. I think around 15 times it's been jammed since it came into operation. And the jamming is, it's very expensive to jam a television station. And it has the effect of knocking out all of the other channels that are on that satellite. So if OMN, for example, is on, satellite X, and that satellite also has BBC, Al Jazeera, etc. When they jam OMN, they jam all of those other stations too. Now, obviously, when that happens, the satellite company hears it from BBC, Al Jazeera, etc. And so it's been very difficult to find satellite companies that are willing to take on some of these diaspora stations. It's not just a problem in Ethiopia; it's a problem in Iran, China, the different countries where governments jam domestic or diaspora stations. For various reasons that I won't get into, OMN was on the air for the first couple of months, and a lot of the students that I talked to, a lot of the protesters I talked to, described the different ways they were able to get information about what was happening in Oromia. And for many, OMN was very important. For others, Facebook was very important. The most common method that people described in terms of how they got information was just phone calls to their friends in neighboring villages, neighboring communities about what was happening. So in absence of media, who else should be gathering information? Well, it's groups like Human Rights Watch or like Human Rights League Horn of Africa, except the local equivalent. Civil society in Ethiopia. Well, since 2009, the Charities and Societies Proclamation was passed, that really decimated independent civil society in Ethiopia. For those of you that aren't too familiar with it, one of the things it did is say that you could not acquire more than 10% of your funding from foreign sources if you work in the areas of human rights, essentially, which meant that a lot of NGOs that were working on that just folded. Some sort of shifted what they worked on to avoid that requirement, or others dramatically scaled back their activities. So again, Oromia protests, massive event, biggest event in Ethiopia since 2005 elections. How many NGOs covered it domestically? One. There wasn't zero, there was actually one. Hrlha, the Human Rights Council, put out a report in March that looked at largely at the first couple months of the protests. But still, for one report to have come out in such a large area, such a massive event for the history of the country is a pretty damning reflection of the status of civil society. So in absence of media, absence of civil society, social media has played a really important role. Facebook, etc. I mean, we did a big report on the extent of surveillance in Ethiopia, looking at telephone surveillance, email surveillance, things like that. And one thing that really struck me was that social media, Facebook in particular, was the one place where young Ethiopians were not afraid to express themselves. Amazing to me, the things that they wrote on social media. You know, that they wouldn't say in an email, they wouldn't say face-to-face, in public certainly. But somehow, I never quite wrapped my head around it, but somehow on Facebook there was a sense that it was anonymous or something like this. And so a lot of, I think one of the ways that the world knew about what was happening in the early days of the Oromia protests was through Facebook. And certainly within Oromia, so many students told me that they found out what was happening because they saw the videos that were posted on Facebook, the same videos that many of you saw. Government's response to that, initially there wasn't much of a response. I was a little surprised that they didn't seem to crack down on Facebook use in the early months of the protest. And then a former intelligence official who had just fled Ethiopia told me, he's like, the reason we didn't crack down on it is because that was how we were getting our information too. It was this amazing tool to understand sort of what the protesters were thinking. So I thought that was quite interesting. It's a very anecdotal comment from him, but again, sort of an interesting comment from an insider. But over the last, about a month and a half, 2 months, the government has blocked social media apps in Oromia, which meant there was just a complete blackout of information. Now some students have found different ways around that, using anonymizers and different tech tools to get around the blocking, but it's still a big problem. So I think all of these different restrictions on information are why it's so important that groups like the Human Rights League Horn of Africa exists. And quite often when something happens in Oromia, the first place I hear about it, beyond sort of a tweet or a 10-second phone call from a contact in Oromia, is through the press releases that Human Rights League Horn of Africa puts out. It's quite often the first place where names are listed of people that were arrested or had problems with the authorities. It's incredibly important for that reason. We do advocacy with different governments around the world, trying to push them to push their ally, to push Ethiopia. One of the things that we constantly hear is that we just don't have good information about Ethiopia. They talk about Somalia, they talk about Kenya, they talk about South Sudan. They have great information on all of that. But when it comes to Ethiopia, outside of Addis, they just don't know what's happening. And yes, there's reports of Human Rights Watch, there's reports from Amnesty, but that's not enough. We need many more voices to be able to express themselves. And I think that, again, that's where the Human Rights League Horn of Africa is very important. We need more organizations like this one who are able to speak up and able to document exactly what is happening. It would make it much easier to move forward on some of these human rights issues if there's a plurality of voices. And we probably have a different perspective about the abuses. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty don't always see eye to eye, but I think having a lot of different organizations who are analyzing these issues from different perspectives is so important. There's lots of groups in the Ethiopian diaspora who work on different issues back home, as you know, but a lot of them are political groups. There are not many who are legitimate human rights groups, and so, again, that's why it's very important that Human Rights League Horn of Africa is doing this type of work. Which isn't to say individuals won't have their own political beliefs, of course everyone does, but the human rights documentation is what is first, and that's very important. Something that strikes me when I do interviews with victims is how excited they get when they see their story in print, or the type of abuse that they went through when they see it documented. It means a lot to victims. It's the whole notion of giving voice to the victims, which sounds like a bit of a cliche, but some of the times where I've gone back and showed the reports and the press releases to those individuals that shared their stories with us, it's a very emotional time for them. They're very, very happy and very proud. And if we have any positive impact from these press releases that I can relate to them, again, you just get this big smile across their face. And I think that's also very, very important. I think also for small NGOs like Human Rights League Horn of Africa, in the world of social media now, it's very easy to amplify the message and amplify the voices. And I think that's something that a lot of small NGOs that work in the diaspora could be doing better. And certainly something that we'd be happy to help is once you have a press release out there, just put it on our Twitter feed and all that kind of stuff to get it moving around. That's why journalists increasingly are finding a lot of their information. You're much more likely to get stories based on a Human Rights League Horn of Africa press release if it's circulated on Twitter or Facebook, things like that. And then I would guess of the, maybe 50% of the journalists that come to us is because they saw something that we wrote, they saw it on Twitter, on Facebook, and want to talk more about it.